He wasn't chanting. He wasn't meditating. He was passed out drunk, reeking of wine and shame. The villagers whispered that he was cursed. His disciples turned their backs on him. Once a revered monk. Now just a broken old man lying in the dirt, clinging to a bottle instead of a prayer bead. But what if I told you? This broken monk reached a kind of enlightenment no sober man ever could? This is not the story of a saint. It's the story of a man who fell so deep into darkness, so far from the path, that he found something most people never do. Something raw, real, and quietly miraculous. And it might just change how you see healing, suffering, and even the Buddha himself. No one knew exactly when he stopped being a monk and started being a problem. He still wore the saffron robe, though it was stained and tattered. But gone were the chants at dawn, the calm steps of mindful walking, the serenity that once followed him like a soft wind. Now, there was only the sharp stench of rice wine, the slurred curses muttered beneath his breath, and the empty stares of villagers who passed by him as if he were already a ghost. Children were told not to go near him. Vendors refused to sell him food unless he paid in full. No one dared to offer him alms anymore. He had become a shameful myth in the village. Don't end up like the drunk monk, they warned. Yet no one asked why. No one dared. What could possibly drive a man of such deep discipline to destroy himself so completely? The old ones whispered that he had lost his faith. Others claimed he had seen something so terrible in meditation that his mind shattered. One rumor said he had killed someone, his own child even. And the guilt drove him mad. But the truth was stranger, more human, and far more dangerous to believe. Because if even a monk, who once sat under waterfalls in silence, who once healed people with a single gaze, could fall into this kind of darkness, then what did that say about the rest of us? Was holiness just a thin veil we all wore, hiding wounds we couldn't name? Or worse, was the path to enlightenment not always lined with lotus petals and incense, but with broken glass, vomit, and shame? Every day, he stumbled through the village like a walking contradiction. He would bow to a rock but spit at the temple gate. He once offered his last coin to a beggar, then stole wine from a shrine. The villagers hated how confused he made them feel. He didn't fit any category. He was a monk, and he was a disgrace. He was spiritual, and he was lost. He was them. And that's what scared them most. Because deep down, everyone had a moment where they, too, almost broke. He just didn't hide it. Before he was the village disgrace, he was their pride. People would travel for days just to hear him speak. Though he rarely spoke, his presence alone could silence a room. They said his eyes held stillness deeper than the forest, and his breath flowed with the wind like he had become part of nature itself. He didn't need to preach. He embodied the teaching. Once a high-ranking monk in a mountain monastery, he was known not for his titles, but for the way he could sit in absolute stillness for days. Birds would land on his shoulders. Wild animals would drink water near his feet, unafraid. Disciples called him the living silence. Foreigners, including scholars and skeptics, left his presence in tears. But no one knew about the life he had before the robe, before the chanting, before the stillness. He had once been a man with a family, a wife, a child, a simple farmer's life that he loved deeply. And then, the famine came. Crops died. People starved. His wife fell ill, and medicine was too far and too expensive. His child cried from hunger until one night, the crying stopped. Permanently. He buried them both in the cold earth, with bare hands, whispering a mantra through tears that froze on his lips. That night, something in him broke, or awakened. He walked away from that life and never returned, not even to look at their graves. He shaved his head, burned every possession he had, and climbed the mountain barefoot to ask to be ordained. The monks saw his grief but mistook it for renunciation. He had not come to escape the world, He had come because there was nothing left to lose. And sometimes, that makes for the most powerful seeker. For years, he meditated with fire in his belly and silence in his bones. He wasn't chasing peace. He was running from pain. But the thing about running from pain is, it always catches up. And when it did, no amount of chanting could drown it out. Enlightenment, they say, comes like a flash of lightning. But his came like thunder years later, booming, shaking, and followed by silence so empty, it terrified him. He realized that while he had mastered the mind, he had never made peace with the heart. And that was the one storm he couldn't outsit. So when a single sip of rice wine finally numbed the ache, it felt more merciful than all the sutras combined. What began as a sip became a flood at first. The wine was a secret. Just a few sips at night to help him sleep. He told himself it was medicinal. After all, the Buddha never strictly forbade alcohol, only warned against intoxication that clouded the mind. And wasn't his mind already shattered? He still meditated, still taught, still walked in slow mindful steps. But something beneath the surface had shifted. His eyes no longer gazed into emptiness with clarity. They stared into it with exhaustion. His disciples noticed. One by one, they began to leave. Not because he was cruel, but because he was empty. The teachings had stopped flowing. The silence had become heavy. What once was pure presence now felt like an echo chamber of grief. Still, he smiled and assured everyone he was fine. That he was just going deeper into solitude. But solitude has an edge. And he slipped. The bottle that once rested at his bedside now traveled with him. At first hidden. Then not. The day he was caught drinking behind the temple altar, the head monk wept. Not out of anger, but out of heartbreak. The man who once inspired hundreds now barely inspired himself. He was asked to leave the monastery. Not formally expelled, but gently pushed out. Take time, they said. Find yourself again. But he didn't want to find anything anymore. He returned to the village at the base of the mountain. The same village where his family had once starved. Only now, no one remembered that part of his story. They only saw a fallen monk. A fraud. He stopped chanting. Stopped sitting. Stopped caring. He began drinking in public. Yelling at dogs. Cursing the Buddha under his breath. People were scandalized. How could someone once so wise become so lost? But the better question was, how could someone so lost ever have seemed so wise? Was it all an illusion? Or was this collapse the continuation of his spiritual path in a form no one could understand? Perhaps he had stopped trying to be a monk and had accidentally started becoming human. Raw. Real. Ruined. But free. In a strange and terrifying way. He laughed now. Not the gentle laugh of a master, but the bitter chuckle of a man who has seen through the curtain and found nothing behind it. And yet, beneath the drunken chaos, if you looked close enough, there was still something unsettling in his gaze. Not madness. Not sadness. But something that resembled awareness. A sharpness hiding inside the mess. As if some part of him was watching the whole thing unfold. As if even in the spiral, he knew he hadn't reached the bottom yet. But when he did, he would either die or wake up. It wasn't a sermon. It wasn't a vision. It wasn't even a moment of rock-bottom collapse. No. The turning point came in the form of a small girl. Dirty feet. Tangled hair. And a wooden bowl in her hands. She couldn't have been more than 7. He was sprawled against the stone wall of the marketplace. Half-conscious. Clutching a bottle. His robe stained with wine and mud. Most people ignored him. Others scowled. But the girl just stood there. Staring. And then, without a word, she knelt down and placed her bowl in front of him. A handful of rice. Still warm. Not much. Barely a meal. But it was everything she had. He blinked at her. Confused. Why? He croaked. She just smiled. Because you look hungry. It wasn't pity. It wasn't charity. It was compassion. Pure. Unfiltered. Uncalculating. The kind of compassion he used to teach about, but hadn't felt in years. And it broke him. Not dramatically. Not with tears or revelations. Just quietly. Like a knot coming undone. That night, he didn't drink. Not because he made a vow. Not because he found God again. But because the warmth of that rice stayed with him longer than the warmth of any alcohol ever had. For the first time in years, he listened to the silence. And it didn't feel like a prison. The next morning, he walked back to the spot, hoping to see her again. She never returned. But he left something behind. A full bottle. Unopened. Sitting beside the empty bowl. From that day on, something in him began to shift. Slowly. Imperceptibly. Like the first breeze before a storm breaks. He didn't become sober overnight. He didn't shave his head or return to robes. But he started doing something strange. He started watching himself. Not judging. Not trying to fix. Just watching. The way he reached for the bottle. The way he reacted to shame. The way he laughed when others cursed him. It was as if a new monk was being born inside him. One that didn't need temples, titles, or rituals. Just awareness. And that, perhaps, was the true beginning of his awakening. Not a mountaintop moment. Just a child. A bowl. And the realization that healing doesn't always look holy. He never returned to the monastery. He never picked up the scriptures again. He never once said the word enlightenment. And yet, those who paid attention began to notice something had changed. He still lived among the filth. Same torn robe. Same alley corner. Same crooked posture on the ground. But there was a stillness now. Not the kind he used to force during meditation. But the kind that came from not needing anything. Not peace. Not approval. Not even sobriety. He still drank. Sometimes. But even that changed. The bottle wasn't a god anymore. It was just a bottle. Some days, he let it sit beside him untouched. Other days, he poured it out for the earth. No one understood what he was doing. But strange things began to happen. People who once crossed the street to avoid him now found themselves sitting near him. Unintentionally at first. Just resting their feet. But then, they'd talk. And he'd listen. Not with advice. Not with platitudes. Just presence. Deep, grounded presence. Some cried. Some laughed. Some just sat in silence. As if his brokenness gave them permission to be whole. One man said he hadn't spoken to anyone in 3 years until that monk, drunk, barefoot, sitting in a puddle, looked him in the eyes and said, "You're not as alone as you think." Another said she hadn't planned to live past that night. Until she heard him humming a lullaby from her childhood while feeding a stray dog with his last rice cake. He never preached. He never claimed to have answers. But people left his presence changed. Not because they saw a holy man. But because they saw someone who had fallen apart. And wasn't hiding it. And somehow, that gave them hope. One evening, a young novice from the monastery came to find him. "They say you've lost the way," the boy said. The monk smiled, wiped his mouth, and replied, "No. I just stopped walking in circles." "But you're not sober," the boy protested. "I'm not drunk either," he said softly. "I'm just here." And in that moment, the novice felt something he hadn't felt in months. Stillness. Not from discipline. From surrender. The old monk didn't need to be pure, or perfect, or revered. He had become something else entirely. A mirror. A paradox. A reminder that sometimes, awakening doesn't happen in temples. It happens in gutters. In shame. In surrender. That the divine doesn't always wear robes. Sometimes, it reeks of wine and speaks in whispers that only the broken can hear. They never built a statue of him. No temple carries his name. No book records his teachings. But ask around that village. And almost everyone has a story. Not about his past glory, but about the strange peace he brought simply by existing. As he was. There was the fruit seller who said the monk just sat beside her one day. Didn't speak. Just smiled. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel bitter about her failing business. Or the grieving widow who said he looked at her and said one sentence, "Grief is love without a place to go." And somehow, that made her sleep again. His presence was messy, human, real, and that's what made it sacred. He didn't tell people to rise above their suffering. He sat with them in it. He didn't speak of transcending the world. He spoke of tasting it fully, pain and all. He never stopped drinking entirely. But his relationship with the bottle changed. It was no longer escape. It was choice. And some days, it was just irrelevant. Inish the path. When he died, it wasn't in a temple. It was under a banyan tree beside the river. Dog curled beside him. Hands resting on his chest. A faint smile on his lips. Some say he was meditating. Others say he was just sleeping. Either way, he left without ceremony. But people gathered. Not to mourn a monk, but to honor a man who dared to be fully human. Who dared to fall, and stay present in the fall. No chants. No bells. Just silence. And then someone whispered. Maybe. He was enlightened after all. And no one disagreed. Not because he fit their idea of a master, but because he broke it. And gave them permission to find their own way. His life was a question N. Thank you for joining me on this unusual journey. The story of the drunk monk. A man who taught us that enlightenment doesn't always come wrapped in robes or perfect silence. Sometimes, it arrives through brokenness. Through messiness. Through surrender. Maybe his story reminds us that healing isn't about fixing ourselves to meet an ideal. It's about embracing who we truly are. Even the parts we're ashamed of. What part of your story feels broken right now? And could it be, just maybe, the very place where your healing begins? If this story touched you, share it with someone who might need to hear it today. And let me know in the comments. What did the drunk monk teach you about suffering, grace, and the strange path to peace? Remember, you're not alone on this journey. Wherever you are, whatever you're facing, there is light. Even in the darkest places.